Welcome back. This is the second part of our lecture on postcolonial studies and postcolonial literatures. This time around, we'll be focusing on postcolonial literatures. So what are they? Postcolonial literatures are defined by the influence of colonialism in perceptual frameworks of contemporary peoples expressed through literature. So in other words, the literature reflects, or the literature shows us the influence of the effects of colonialism on these peoples and their perceptual frameworks, that is, their mindsets, their worldviews. Literature expresses that, and it is through the reading and studying of these literatures that we'll get to learn more about the effects of colonialism and how these peoples today live their world and view their world, and how that has an impact also on our view of the world. Semantic basis for the term post-colonial refers to national culture after the departure of the imperial power. So there's a difference between the period before independence and after independence. Post-colonial means that after independence from the European empires and what goes on in these nations and peoples, and how that is portrayed in their literatures and in their art in general. Postcolonial, however, refers to all the culture affected by the imperial process. So a more general sense of the term postcolonial concerns itself not only with what happens after independence, but what has happened in these cultures and countries throughout their history, from colonization to the present, during and after, and including today. Now, postcolonial literature has developed in different stages. A first stage of literatures of this type were produced by the representatives of the empires that were located in these places. So they're generally white people writing their own literature from the colonies. So they're not very good representatives, hence the quotation marks around the word representatives, because they were writing from a position of the center. Even though they were living in the colonies, they were writing from the point of view of the British or the Spanish or the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch. So it's not a good example of what we consider postcolonial literature today. However, postcolonial studies also concerns itself, or themselves, sorry, with this literature, because it's a way of entering the world from the perspective of the center and not just the subordinated peoples, but also the imperial powers and how they saw and how they perceived the world and their position within that world at that time. Now, there's a second stage in which more native writers started to produce their own literature, but they needed permission from the empires. So it's also not the best way of putting a voice to the postcolonial reality, because they were dependent upon a patronage system in which they could only write and publish their work if the center, if the empire would give them permission. So it isn't until after this stage that more subversive forms of literature that start to complain and to discuss their colonial situation that we get postcolonial literatures as we know them today. More subversive, more voice, more accurate in their portrayal of reality in the position of the other. Now, traditionally in these literatures and in these cultures, we see cultural hegemony at play. There were Eurocentric assumptions and attitudes toward postcolonial literatures as isolated national offshoots of English literature. So the literatures produced in the colonies in Africa, in America, in Asia, even in certain parts of Europe, was not of value to the eyes of the European world. So it was a long time before these literatures could gain a position from which they would be studied and perceived at the same level as other literatures around the world. And even today, they struggle for this position. Also, the imperial oppression came in the form of education if we talk particularly about the English world and the English-speaking world, we get that in the colonies or the former colonies, education had been so strong in positioning English as the central language, and the version of English that was taught in schools was the one true form of English. And other forms of English were considered impure, so rejected as true forms of literature. Now, today, postcolonial studies struggles to vindicate these literatures and give them the position that they deserve in the literary arena. Now, another point that is important to be considered is place and displacement. Special postcolonial crisis of identity. Let's keep in mind that many of these cultures and many of these peoples had to be displaced. They were removed from their original territories and brought to Europe, or they were just removed to other areas of their own country because the imperial powers were taking possession of their land. So these movements, this dislocation because of migration, because of enslavement, transportation, or even voluntary removal, resulted in a crisis of identity. So in these literatures, we can see how many of these authors and their characters and their voices in the literature express a loss of identity. They don't know who they are truly. Are they African? Are they Caribbean? Are they, or are they European because of all the influence that they have received from the imperial power? Along this comes a sense of cultural denigration and oppression of the indigenous personality and culture by a superior racial or cultural model. In other words, they're not good enough. They're not important enough. They're oppressed in their own culture. And I know that we're familiar with this idea ever since in primary school, we are taught about the oppression of the indigenous populations in America by the Spanish Empire. So what we see here is exactly the same, but how it is portrayed in the literature is what postcolonial studies is interested in. Also, with this cultural denigration comes a social and linguistic alienation. There are categories that are restraining, like master-slave, free versus bonded, ruler versus ruled. So these dichotomies and these categorizations of people, of human beings, is clearly and strongly portrayed in the literature that they produced and that we'll be reading. Also, they are trying to seek an alternative because of all these crises of identity, of trying to construct new identities, differentiated, stronger, more relatable, and they transform also the uses of their language. Who is anybody to say that their version of English is wrong or is less pure or is less important? So there's a strong movement of these authors that start to use new forms of English and new forms of describing their own otherness as acceptable identities in their own right. When we talk finally about postcolonial literary theory, what it really tries to do is to portray or to show the inability of European theory to deal with the complexities of postcolonial literatures. In other words, with this emergence of new literatures and identities and uses of language, particularly the English language, which is the one that we're interested in, there's no way the traditional European white theories of literature apply well to the study of postcolonial literature. So postcolonial studies offers a new form of dealing with this literature and understanding it, for which the traditional theories were not enough. So there's a development of specific national and regional consciousness too, and there's nationalism has a lot to do with that. And also from this marginality, from this position of relegation of writing from the borders and not from the center, of writing from the position of the other, there's new creative power that arises in literature. So the post-colonial literatures offer an alternative that is quite different from the Eurocentric position and the Eurocentric ideologies, and they offer new creative forms of literature and of how to view the world in their literature. So all of this comes from this book, The Empire Writes Back, Theory and Practice in Postcolonial Literatures by Ashcroft and other authors. So I hope this would clarify the topic. And if not, we'll get a chance to discuss this in class and clarify any doubts you might have. So see you in class.